And below, the destruction and the degradation of forests and soils and wetlands that are natural carbon sinks means that at the same time we are removing the living landscapes on the surface that absorb and restore balance. Scientists who carefully study this situation have warned us with increasing urgency that it is a perilous pattern and trajectory that if unchecked will cause massive migration, suffering, and death, and eventually would render the planet uninhabitable for humans. Nature is also making the point directly. Already we have seen stronger storms, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, melting ice caps, rising sea levels. And actually there is a kind of terrible beauty in the demonstration that only a few degrees of difference changes ice to water. And the ice melting at the poles causes the water to rise, even in the Hudson River that flows by Union. I sometimes think of what this means in light of the saying that I have read attributed to St. John of Damascus: the whole earth is a living icon of the face of God. My own work is focused on the root causes of the climate crisis. I grew up around conversations about global warming and climate change because it was a big part of my father's work. But I did not go into this field myself in my own way until the year 2014. I had just graduated from Union for a degree I went to in midlife after working as a lawyer and a writer and an administrator in nonprofits, being a mother as well. And I got a job at Union after graduation to work on public programming. That year, the Secretary General of the United Nations, it was then Ban Ki-moon of South Korea, called a climate summit to engage civil society in meeting this challenge. And so we held the Religions for the Earth Conference. Over 200 religious and spiritual leaders from around the world gathered with the goal to reframe climate change as a moral issue. And in the wake of that gathering, we founded the Center for Earth Ethics, which I now direct. We work through education, convening, and movement building, drawing from the world's religious and wisdom traditions, exploring the spiritual dimensions of ecology, and working to discern and pursue the changes necessary to create a society that measures value according to the long-term health of the whole. Ecumenical and interreligious dialogue is a powerful force for good in the world. It distills values we hold in common, regardless of dogma and doctrine, and it also reveals assumptions in the secular mainstream world that reflect judgments about value and moral claims, even if they are not clearly presented as such. Data and science are important, but they are not enough. We already know what we need to know. 80% of the world's energy still comes from fossil fuels, and there are those planning to explore and drill for more, including in deeply cherished landscapes, such as the Arctic refuge, risking leaks and spills in addition to everything else. Half of the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere right now have been put up there in the last 20 years, which is the time that we have known the most about this and had the most available, viable, affordable alternatives in the form of renewable energies from wind and sun, which is a stroke of mercy and grace, if there ever was one. I am not the first to invoke the words in Deuteronomy in this context. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. Climate activists like to say that you cannot negotiate with physics, and they are right. I would add to that, though, this is not just about physics, it is also about metaphysics. It is about our attitudes towards nature and thereby ourselves. It is about our connection to one another across time, space, and even species. And it is about our ability to perceive truth and let it transform us. A friend of mine at the Church of Sweden posits that in any room where there are decisions being made about climate or energy policy, there should be 3 empty chairs designated for those who are both least likely to have a voice and most impacted. One for the poor and marginalized people of the world, one for future generations, and one for all non-human life. And if you think about it, it is not just that this would be more fair to consider those empty chairs. It is that it would be smart and true. Had we considered them all along, we would not be in peril. The well-being of the parts are integral to the well-being of the whole. We have drawn the circle of moral concern in a mistaken way. There is a theologian I admire, Cynthia Mola-Beda, who draws on the work and experience of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was briefly at Union and who was executed by the Nazis in his native Germany after he went home to resist Hitler. She explores the concept of structural evil and points out that one key characteristic of structural evil is that it easily masquerades as good. Part of the reason that we have made and continue to make such a big mistake with this ecological destruction is that the main activities that drive it are done in the name of economic growth, which has been held up as the primary moral mandate of our time. When the United Nations was founded 75 years ago this year, on October 24th, 1945, in the wake of two devastating world wars, the United States was ascendant in the world, and the way of thinking that was centered in Western Europe and the United States became the basis for the economic development model. The thinking was that to avoid military conflict, there must be more commerce. There was a saying, when goods don't cross borders, armies do. And thus production and consumption cycles became associated and perhaps even confused with peace building. And in fact, there was a codification of the way of thinking in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where international financial institutions were coming into being, in which the measurement of GDP, gross domestic product, or GNP, sometimes called, was first put into use. GDP is still primarily how we measure economic growth. It doesn't count four key things: pollution, depletion of resources, inequality, or the positive effects of long-term investments in culture, conservation, and care for others. In the language of economics, these things are called externalities, meaning you don't have to think about them. Of course, we recognize that there has been progress in modern times in mitigating dire poverty and that there is such a thing as healthy economic growth, but there has also been a monetization and commodification mindset that has been destructive to many cultures, and a short-term way of thinking about those things that has brought on ecological devastation that is self-defeating in the long term. It is worth noting that many of the voices that have flagged this and called for a rethinking have come from spiritual thinkers, and particularly, at least originally, those from outside of that dominant Western mindset. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, more commonly known as the Iroquois, and it is a matriarchal culture, we should note, published a kind of manifesto in 1978 called A Basic Call to Consciousness. It warned about the changes in the weather that would come from the increasing levels of pollution and the rates of deforestation. And they wrote starkly about pushing the model of development and the worldview about nature on the rest of the world. The same model they said was first imposed on them right here in what is now the United States. Quote, the majority of the world does not find its roots in Western culture or traditions. The majority of the world finds its roots in the natural world, and it is the natural world and the traditions of the natural world that must prevail if we are to develop truly free and egalitarian societies. It is also worth noting that in 1948, the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, the human population was about 2.4 billion. Today, there are about 7.6 billion people on Earth, and we will be 11 to 12 billion by the end of this century. At the same time, wild animal populations have been decimated. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Since the basic call to consciousness, there's actually been a huge increase in the severity and reach of consumer culture and in ecological devastation. Yes, there have been important countermeasures, notably the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, both done in 2015. But there is still a troubling push for privatization and commodification, even within those frameworks, calling it green growth while ceding the notion of development to those who simply want to create markets for their products. And here I want to commend the leadership of the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew for publicly addressing these concerns with the passion and depth they deserve. For example, at the Budapest Water Summit in November 2016, he said, quote, "Water is as life-giving and sacred as the blood that runs through our body. It does not belong to any individual or any industry, but is the inviolable and non-negotiable right of every human being." Human beings are social creatures, responding to social cues to fit in and go with the flow. This accounts for much of the cognitive dissonance of the climate crisis. We all go on as if nothing is wrong because everyone else does too. Of course, this is different across socioeconomic lines. Those with the most money are the most responsible for the emissions, and those with the least suffer the most from their impacts, a particularly cruel aspect of this whole scenario. But to the extent that we can generalize about human behavior in these high-consuming parts of the world, perhaps the thing we need most is a bit of distancing from the social norms we have created. I don't want to minimize the suffering caused by this pandemic at all, and let me offer sincere condolences to anyone and everyone who has suffered from the loss of life and from the anxiety it has caused, and economic hardship. But I do want to dwell on what it has revealed and continues to reveal, and how it might guide us forward. It has revealed the inequities of our society in a way that we cannot look away from, including racial inequities. It has revealed what is truly essential in our lives, including our reliance on essential workers, which it turns out are not money managers and movie stars, but are instead farmers and sanitation workers, nurses, grocery store shelf stackers, public transport operators, caregivers. The social distancing mandated by the pandemic has also decreased travel, resulting in less pollution, which in return has resulted in a revival of healthy wildlife in some places. It has rooted people in place, causing many to discover some things about our immediate surroundings for the first time. It prompts us to cultivate and appreciate local economies and those who facilitate them, both of which are necessary for a more humane and sustainable world. And as evidenced by all these virtual conferences and workplaces, it shows that widespread, rapid social change is possible if it is deemed necessary. The most powerful new voice for the type of rapid collective action when it comes to climate action that's needed has been a Swedish teenager, Greta Thunberg, who has stated that her autism is a superpower, because it means she does not care about social cues. She has always been more than happy to socially distance. The documentary movie I Am Greta conveys that she spent years in extreme fasting and barely speaking. Surely this indicates something about the presence of the spirit of the ancient and medieval mystics among us now, reminding us of their way of being in the world. Saint Catherine of Siena lived that way in the 14th century until, by her own account, Jesus appeared to her with the message to leave her life of withdrawn solitude and begin one of teaching and helping others. Her teachings speak to the healing power of awareness of the divine oneness of life. In one of her dialogues, Saint Catherine of Siena expressed it this way: "The soul is in God and God is in the soul, just as the fish is in the sea and the sea is in the fish." Social distancing can facilitate spiritual connection, not only in the purity of the ascetic tradition, but also in the more common experience of heightened appreciation for physical togetherness. We discover new ways of communion with others. Of course, we cannot mistake virtual reality for the spiritual realm. That would be a very bad mistake. But we can hope for technology to serve, in the spirit of the root words techne and logos, to be a way towards the knowledge that we really need. And in the end, what we really need is to return to earth. This pandemic is likely one of the zoonotic diseases that leap from animals to humans as a result of the stress and strain that our species has put on the natural order in our haste to organize ourselves as separate and superior and over and above it. We'll have to ask Dr. Fisher about that, actually. The other theory would be that it came from a lab, and it would still hold true. What my conclusion is that perhaps one goal of spiritual combat in the time of pandemic is simply to stop looking for a way out of the web of life and to behave as if we belong here within it, even if in a fallen state, aware of our bodies as vehicles of spiritual ascent, our bodies made of the same material stuff, iron in our blood, air in our lungs, and so on, that comprises the divinely infused creation here to guide us. Orthodox theologian John Chryssavgis has written, there is a radical asceticism involved in suspending our preconceived notion of how the world should be, and a revolutionary mysticism involved in acknowledging that Mother Nature sometimes knows best. In any event, dwelling indoors on screens is not going to save us, but a shift in perception inspired by this pandemic very well may. There are no externalities. There is only communion. The sea is in the fish. The earth is in us. Let us heal and return. Thank you.